Some of you know me, some of you don't know me, some of you don't want to know me, but let me tell you a little bit about myself, particularly in reference to what we're going to talk about today. As Lynn just said, I'm a historian by training with a focus on Civil War, Reconstruction, late 19th century. I did that a million years ago when I first got out of graduate school, and then went over to the dark side and became an administrator for many, many, many years. But since retiring and moving down here to the Eastern Shore, which quite frankly I knew absolutely nothing about. I didn't even know that there was such a place called the Eastern Shore. And we moved down here primarily because of grandkids and the cost of living as well. So, and when I started to nose around, I found, wow, this place really, really has an interesting history. And not only does it have an interesting history, but it's a history unlike any other that I ever encountered. Much of my research and writing in the old days had focused on the South, and I was pretty conversant with that history, particularly Civil War, Reconstruction, late 19th, early 20th century. And having lived in the North, born in New York City and taught in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I was fairly conversant with that region's history. But the history of the Eastern Shore, and even more so, the history of Talbot County, was one that I had never encountered before. And there's been a fair amount written about this peculiar place, and much of it focuses on the fact that the Eastern Shore in general, and Talbot County in particular, it is not north, is not south, is itself. And there is nothing quite like it, at least within the rest of the 50 states of the United States. So that got me digging into the history of the area. As Lynn said, I've taught a couple of courses focusing specifically on the area that I know the most about, which is the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then, while I was doing much of that research in 2018, 2019, 2020, I heard rumblings about there's a statue in the middle of this town, and that statue seemed to be drawing a whole lot of attention. Now, candidly, I did not myself get much involved in that interaction over that statue. I had other things going on in my life, and so for better or worse, I wasn't involved. For our purposes today, that's probably a good thing, because I can hopefully have a little bit of objectivity relative to the topic. My interest in this topic, I need to tell you, is not the last 10, 15, 20 years of the Talbot Boys Monument. We'll cover that, we'll talk about it some. But that's not really what I find so fascinating about this topic. let me say something provocative. I said to myself earlier today, you're not going to say this, but I'm going to say it. I think the Talbot Boys Confederate Monument was going to be removed, irrespective of what I felt or what you felt or really what anybody felt. I think it was inevitable that the political and economic forces here in Talbot County inevitably would see to its removal. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, you can determine for yourself. And so that's not the part of the story, as I say, that I find so interesting. What I find interesting is why it was here in the first place. Why in the year 1914, some 50 or so years after the Civil War's over, after many of the men who had fought in the Civil War were either dead or not in real good shape, why was there a movement to put a Confederate monument in a state which had not been part of the Confederacy? Now, I understand that Maryland was different during the Civil War. Maryland's always been different. And during the Civil War was different. So what went on in Baltimore during the Civil War was not what was going on in the south of the state. And the sentiments in Baltimore were not the same as the sentiments in the south of the state. And Talbot County in particular, during the Civil War, was different. Because the sentiments in Easton were not the sentiments in other parts of the county. And I've talked about that in an earlier course. So, coming to some conclusions about why this monument was here, number one, in a state that was not part of the Confederacy, and number two, why it stayed here for something like 110 years. It was the last Confederate monument in Maryland on public ground to be removed. The last one. That's the part of the story that I find interesting. So, I'd like to talk about that today. I'm going to ask that we hold questions. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask questions, for you to say, Messner, you're full of balloon juice. I think such and such and such and such, that's fine, okay? As long as we remain respectful and civil and all that good stuff, which I'm sure you will. All right. No Common Ground. That's the title of this book. There's actually a book that has been written on Confederate monuments. Just published within the last 2 years. The thesis of this book on Confederate monuments is that there is no common ground. You're either against Confederate monuments, you're against the fact that they were placed where they were placed, and you are hell-bent on trying to ensure that they come down. Or you feel that Confederate monuments are part of the heritage and part of the history of the given area and have as much quote-unquote right to be displayed publicly, even on public property. as a statue of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. I'm not sure I agree with the thesis of this book, at least not insofar as Talbot County is concerned. Because, and we'll talk about this a little later, insofar as Talbot County is concerned, I think there was some common ground. Even if there wasn't common ground on the issues, my impression was that there was common ground in terms of the interaction and the respect that was given from both sides on this. But we'll get back to that a little bit. So, moving on. The history of the monument goes back to 1914, when the base was put in place. The erection of this monument was part of a wave of monuments throughout the South being erected during this time period. There were, let me get my numbers straight here, at least 300 Confederate monuments that were erected throughout the South from the period 1900 to 1920. In fact, if you look at, my apologies, I meant to get this up there, but I didn't. This is a graph of monument building, Confederate monument building.
One end is what year?
Yeah. And this Mount Everest of monument building begins in about the year 1900 and ends in about the year 1920. Goes like this. And the question becomes, how come? How come here in Talbot County there was this impulse to build a Confederate monument 50 years after the Civil War? And different historians who have looked at this have given different reasons. One of the most accepted reasons is that this was an effort on the part of some Southerners to, number one, validate the Southern Confederate war effort. It was an effort on the part of those individuals to shape that war effort as an effort focused on states' rights against an overarching federal government. And it was an effort to downplay the fact that the Civil War was at its base a fight over slavery. So the monument itself was erected here in Talbot County, and when you look at what went on in Talbot County relative to the motives that led individuals to support the construction of a monument, you find that much of that general thesis about this was a reaction against the Civil War, this was an effort to build the Confederate effort up and minimize the Union effort, You don't find much evidence for that. If we go on to the next, the base of the monument, 1914. Took another 2 years to get him added on top. Now, the reason for that it took a whole 2 years, in fact, took a lot longer, really, because the planning behind the Confederate monument started sometime around 1912. So it was a 4-year effort to get the statue put up. If we could go on. This was one of the prime movers in the effort to have the Confederate monument put in place, Oswald Tillman. Who's Mr. Tillman? What did he do that is notable even today?
He was the son of General Tench Tillman.
He what?
He was the son of General Tench Tillman.
Not a direct son. Tench Tillman had no sons. He had 2 daughters, so to go down a couple generations.
Yeah, he was part of that. What did he... He's probably best known today in some circles as having written a history, if you will, of Talbot County. And it's interesting, it's more of a biography of notable individuals who had lived in and shaped the history of Talbot County from about 1650 through about 1900. And it's interesting the title that he gave to these gentlemen who he wrote about. He called them the worthies of Talbot County. And the worthies, these gentlemen, all had 2 things in common. Number one, they were gentlemen. There wasn't a woman among them. And they were white. Wasn't any person of color among them. Tillman had fought in the Civil War. Confederate. So Tillman had been wounded in the Civil War. Spent 2 years in a prison camp, I think in Illinois. And then had come out of the Civil War, come home to Talbot County, and gotten involved in a whole variety of various civic and business affairs, as well as writing his history. The other gentleman,
You want me to change the slide?
who was, yeah, want to flip it if you can?
I can.
The other gentleman who was central to this process was Joseph B. Seth. Seth had not taken part in the Civil War. He was part of that generation that had come to influence in Talbot County that were not Civil War veterans. And he was an unabashed admirer of the Southern Confederate movement. And throughout his life, he promoted and wrote about the glories, if you want to call it that, of the Confederacy and those individuals, particularly the individuals from Talbot County, who had taken part on the Confederate side in the war. Just looking here for a quote. If we can go on. Third individual who was involved was not from Talbot County. David Greg McIntosh, he was from up in the Baltimore area. Seth, his colleagues had difficulty in terms of arranging for the erection of this monument. They went to the county commissioners. The county commissioners very gladly gave their blessing to the statue and putting it on county land, right by the county building. But as far as I'm aware, they didn't give 1 penny for the erection of the statue. Rather, they patted Seth and colleagues on the back and said, go do it. So they initially gathered enough for the base that you just saw, and then spent the next 2 years trying to affect the top of the statue. And the problem was that they ran into was, number one, it took time to raise the money. Number two, they didn't exactly know who these Confederate soldiers were from Talbot County. They wanted to put the names on the statue, but getting an accurate delineation of who exactly from Talbot County went to fight for the Confederacy was somewhat of a challenge. And then the third challenge was, what's the top of the statue going to look like? And some individuals wanted some Olympic-style Zeus that would exemplify courage and valor and all that. Others wanted Admiral Buchanan. Who was Admiral Buchanan?
Commandant.
Excuse me?
First Commandant of the Naval Academy.
First Commandant of the Naval Academy, and in terms of the Civil War,
He left the Union and fought for the South.
yeah, he was the highest ranking Confederate official or military official from Talbot County. And so some individuals wanted him to be up there on the statue. And so they went back and forth about what's it going to be. And they came up with what we had, the soldiers. Maybe can we go back?
Yeah.
There you go. That's what they came up with. Now, if you read the news reports of the day, supposedly they went to great lengths to fashion this in an artistic, first-rate manner. The only problem with that is this statue is similar to about 200 other statues that were put in place in the South in the years from 1900 to 1920. In fact, there was one firm in the South that literally mass-produced these things. So how much care, expertise, and the like went into the crafting of this is anybody's guess.
Quick question, the
Yeah.
daughters of the American.
Excuse me?
The daughters of the American Confederacy.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that.
That's what it says on the side.
In terms of the campaign, fundraising campaign, to get this statue in place, interesting part is that it wasn't exclusively a female effort, but the Daughters of the Confederacy played a central role in raising the money for the statue. It wasn't primarily Confederate veterans themselves, which is not to say they didn't play a role in it. But many women were involved in this effort, and you're not liking that, but
It's not what the Maryland Historic Trust.
excuse me?
It's not what the Maryland Historic Trust says. The Maryland Historic Trust does not say that, and I was just asking for your source
Yeah.
for that.
So, we have a statue. If we can go on. Let's go back. So the statue goes up. McIntosh is brought down here from Baltimore and plays a primary role in approaching various folks for support for the statue. And by 1916, if I'm not mistaken, the statue is dedicated, with McIntosh giving an address suitable to the occasion. Yes?
What was his interest in this?
Well, that's a good question, to which I'm not sure I can give a good answer, except that he was a Confederate veteran and he was committed to the perpetuation of the memory and whatever you want to call it, of the Confederacy. And he thought this merited his support. I don't know that he had any monetary inducement to be involved. I'm not aware of that. I haven't seen any evidence of that. If we can go on. This is sort of an interesting sideline to the whole affair. I'm smiling here at George, because George and I live over in the Eastern Club East. And when I moved down there 6-7 years ago, I would regularly go running through this area of woods that abutted Eastern Club East. And one day I happened to see that there was this plaque, and that this was a forest tract that was given as a memorial to General Seth by his wife. And so General Seth, if for no other reason, has been memorialized here for the last, I think she did that sometime in the 1920s. So the last 100 years, General Seth has had a forest named after him. Okay, moving on. The statue goes up, and the statue is largely forgotten about. Now, people knew it was there, but by the post-World War II period, nobody was paying a whole lot of attention to the statue. Evidence for that. Number one, we have this article in the Times Record from, I think it's from 73 or 74, saying, we don't know where the statue came from. And so delving into where in God's name did this statue come from? How did it get here on the courthouse lawn? We go on to the next. Evidence for the fact that people had pretty much forgotten about the statue was that the statue by the 1970s was in pretty horrific condition. It had been allowed to deteriorate, and nobody really cared, at least not given the evidence that I've seen. That, however, changed. And so if we go on, in the 1990s, we're not quite there yet. In the 1990s, there is an effort to clean up the statue. Exactly why and who, I don't know. One interesting dimension to that effort, though, is if you read about it, it's difficult to discern that this is a Confederate statue. As it was written about in the 1990s, it was a Civil War monument. And not much, if anything, was made of the fact that these 84 names were Confederates. All right, so, another interesting, I was going to say sidelight, but I don't really think it's a sidelight. With the turn of the century, the new century, 21st century, there is an effort to recognize Frederick Douglass in some official way. And the most official way that proponents of this idea could conjure up was to have a statue of Douglass erected on the courthouse lawn. Now, that effort, I think 2004, if I'm not mistaken, gained approval from county commissioners. Again, not one penny was appropriated for that. The folks who were pushing for it, NAACP, ACLU, and others, were told, now go out and raise the money. And it took some 7 years, I think, to come up with the money to erect the statue. The statue of Douglass was not uniformly embraced. Some veterans groups took exception to the fact that courthouse grounds were there to honor American veterans. And so you have the statues on the side of the courthouse lawn for Korea, for World War II and the like. And you had the Confederate statue. But Douglass wasn't a veteran. Now, there's a certain irony in the folks who objected to the Douglass statue saying courthouse grounds only for American veterans, when in fact there was a statue there for Confederate veterans. And Confederate veterans, in fact, and here you may take great issue, had committed treason.
But they were all pardoned,
They were all.
Yes, they were.
including Robert E. Lee.
Yeah,
So they are
Veterans.
veterans, they are pardoned by the government of the United States of America.
that's
So they're
right.
not criminals any longer.
Yeah,
They're pardoned.
yeah. But the fact that individuals who were fought against the United States government could be honored, and Frederick Douglass, who spent from 1863 to 1865, moving heaven and earth to recruit troops, black troops, to fight for the Union could not be, was a little galling to some folks. On the other hand, there was a certain body of opinion in Talbot County that said, let them have their statue, because the Douglas statue will balance the Confederate statue. And therefore, anyone who objects to the Confederate statue can no longer object because Douglas has his statue. Well, as we know, that's not quite the way it played out. One final fact about the Douglas statue. This is from the front. And as you can read, there's only one word, Douglas. If you go around the back of the statue and read the plaque on the back of the statue, I think whoever penned that plaque did a wonderful job. Because the plaque reads Frederick Douglass, and then it lists those activities that he was involved in, primarily, although not exclusively, supporting the war effort and after the war. And so it lists about 6 or 7 different either positions or functions that he had filled. And then at the bottom of the plaque, there's one word. What's the word? Slave.
Do you have it?
Excuse me?
Can you read it to us so everybody understands?
I'm
Do
sorry.
you have a picture of
Do
it?
you have a copy of it so you can read to everybody so you can understand?
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm sorry. Well, that's not true. I do have a picture, but it's not over there. It's on my phone.
Trina's Googling it.
And, yeah, go take a look. As I say, whoever
So interested in listening to this.
constructed that, I thought, did a wonderful job. All right, so the Frederick Douglass statue was erected. Moving on. (2016) ACLU NAACP challenged secret vote to keep Confederate statue in Talbot. 2016, and here's where your knowledge of what went on in Talbot County may well supersede mine. But what I have read was that at least while certain individuals had been working for a long time to get the Confederate statue removed, the really precipitating event on the national level that brought it to a whole other level was the murder of 9 individuals in the black church in, got it here in my notes. Excuse me?
So she has, Charleston, she has the back wording on the statue. If you
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It says,
Speak up.
in a composite nation like ours, as before the law, there should be no rich, no poor, no high, no low, no white, no black, but common country, common citizenship, equal rights, and a common destiny. Frederick Douglass, 1818 to 1895. United States Marshal, Charge d'Affaires to the Dominican Republic, Minister to Haiti, Counselor to President Abraham Lincoln, publisher, author, orator, abolitionist, slave.
Yeah,
Could
Thank you.
everyone hear that?
yeah.
Thank you.
2016, 9 members of the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston were murdered by a white supremacist, a young man who entered into the church. If you've read those accounts, entered into what was portrayed, at least by those who survived, as sort of a non-hostile
It was Bible
It was a Bible study.
interaction, and then proceeded to kill him. And that kicks off, or if not kicks off, then certainly brings to another level here in Talbot County the effort to take the statue down, move the statue. That simply the time has come. It's the last one in Maryland on public ground and needs to be moved. The county council holds a secret vote to determine whether they're going to be supportive of that or not. They decide they're not, and the NAACP and the ACLU challenges a secret vote. You can't do that. In fact, they are, the court agrees with them. You can't take a secret vote on this matter. This is a public matter, and there's no reason in the world it shouldn't be discussed, debated, and voted on out in public. So if we can go to the next. Therein ensues a great debate about the statute. Opposition to the removal centers around the notion that really what you're trying to do here by moving the statute is that you're erasing history. They also claim that there are outside agitators and extremists who are involved in this effort, and it's not really the true sentiment of the majority of people in Talbot County. And if you can bear with me for a second, here's a statement that was made at the time in support of that position. This individual who was writing in a publication I'm not familiar with called Chesapeake Cousins. Anybody familiar with that? I'm not. But anyway, this was, I guess, a letter to the editor that states this: the Civil War was a terrible period in United States history. And as such, we need to keep these men close to our hearts because they are all Americans. We need to have the respect and courage to live today and not dwell in the past, trying to find something or someone to blame and destroying monuments to heroic Americans. It is part of our history and cannot be erased. So that was the argument for keeping it up. The counter argument was made fairly locally by, and I'm not sure I've got the pronunciation right here, Heather Mejure, former Democratic state lawmaker. Am I? Yeah, you got that right? Okay, and she said at the time, the Talbot Boys Memorial, like all Confederate monuments, elevates and idolizes traitors to our country who were complicit in the enslavement of Black people in America. There is no glory in the story of slave-holding seditionists. So, too obvious opposing sentiments there. If we can go on.
Next week.
The Talbot County Council then reconsiders the matter in the open and refuses to remove the statute. This again is 2016. And Corey Peck, council president at the time, provides the rationale. We feel it would be disrespectful to the family members of those Confederates still alive in Talbot County. And so the council refuses. But that's, of course, as we're all aware, not the end of the story. The beat goes on. And over the next several years, agitation to take the statue down builds and builds. Refresh my memory.
Your name?
And, yeah, has done a very nice job of documenting this agitation that went on over this period, over what, 3-4 year period?
2 years.
2 years? Yeah. And we had a visual that moved, actually, but for some reason it's not compatible with the system here, so we just have 1 or 2 stills. Is there another? No?
No, this is
Okay.
the next one.
My apologies. So, the agitation bills, I think many folks recollect marches and demonstrations on the courthouse lawn and all. What I find remarkable about that whole process is that it was largely civil. That even though there was heat and argumentation and maybe even some, I've seen hundreds of you have some pictures of one fellow in particular getting very exercised relative to what was going on up there. Was that you?
No, that was a rabbi. He would get all
That was you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but no blows were ever exchanged, no.
I think we really have Joe Gamble to thank for that. I think he has been a force for civility. And we
Yeah.
really owe him a debt of thanks every time the statue is moved. I mean,
Yeah.
really.
So, I'll get back to the no common ground notion that we began with. I do think there was common ground, and I think both sides accepted the fact, or bought into the fact, maybe is a better way of putting it, that they weren't going to let it get out of hand. That was in no one's best interest to have this thing become physical, become violent, and the like, and that's more that can be said in a lot of areas of this country, be it issues similar to this or other issues where this has been literally fought out. The September 15th, 2021, a day that will live in, you fill in the blank, depending on where you stand on the issue. The council votes to take the statute down. And let me just quote Corey Peck. the same individual who 4 years earlier, 5 years earlier, had said it would be disrespectful to take it down, has obviously changed his mind. And he's one of the 3 council members who votes to remove it. And he says, or said at the time, we may not know individually why those men, the Confederate soldiers, went to fight. Perhaps because their friend down the street was going off to fight. Perhaps because they were bored. Perhaps because they truly believed in what the Confederacy stood for. We don't know. And I think he was absolutely correct in that regard. Both Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers went off for a whole host of reasons. But what we do know is the overarching umbrella that the Confederacy stood for. And that was most notably the enslavement of black people. And no matter how you cut it, had the Confederacy won, that would have continued on. Written within the documents of their Articles of Confederacy is the continuation of slavery. So Pack has changed his mind. I don't know Mr. Pack, but I can just imagine the position he was in was an incredibly uncomfortable one.
You know, he's black.
Oh, I'm well aware that he's black and he's a Republican. And so there were a host of, pressures this way, that way, and the other way. But it came down. See, we do have another picture. And so the statue comes down. And unlike some statues that have come down, and I can only recollect the statues in East Germany coming down, and they came down. This statue was removed and now is in a private museum in Virginia. Wasn't destroyed, wasn't pulled down, which I think, quite frankly, and I think everybody would agree, was all to the good. It would have been a real scar if that had occurred.
Was it paid for, the removal paid for by private funds?
Yeah, $80-some thousand to remove it by private funds. In fact, that's fascinating. It was private funds that paid to have it put up, and it was private funds that were paid to have it removed. So, going on. That's the end of the story, except it's not. The story lives on. You may or may not be aware that there is a group that has formed in Talbot County called Remembering the Talbot Boys. They've become more visible in the last 4, 5, 6 months. Let me just, somewhere here, I've got some quotes from them. The goal of their organization is to honor and preserve the memory of a local man, landmark, and important piece of history. And the website is replete with comments made defending the monument, Confederate soldiers in general, and efforts at, quote unquote, erasing history. Of course, there would be some who would argue it wasn't history that was being erased. But again, that's in the eye of the beholder. It'll be interesting to see if this just peters out, this effort, or lives on for some time. So, the Talbot Boys. I think it reflects both the fact that it was here for so long and the fact that it was removed in the fashion that it was, a lot about Talbot County. And you can argue one way or the other whether it's good or bad about Talbot County, but I think the whole process was a peculiarly Talbot County phenomenon. And I'm not aware that any place else has gone about the process in quite the same way. So, all right. Questions? Yes, sir. Well, this gentleman, no, you had the hand up first. Come on.
Okay, so.
Don't be bashful. I got a feeling you're not.
I'm Paul Callahan, and I wrote the book.
You got to talk up a little bit. I'm deaf.
I'm sorry, my name is Paul Callahan.
Yeah.
I wrote the book When Democracy Fell, the Subjugation of Maryland,
Yeah.
the Civil War. Have you read it by any chance?
Yeah.
Have you read it? By the way, it was just released last month. But in the book, I don't touch the Talbot Boys, so I don't go there. But I did research on their enlistments.
Yeah.
And about over half, enlisted a very short time after the drug our judge for Talbot County Courts, being unconscious.
Yeah.
It was on a cover, because that's the image of the
Yeah.
Democracy Fell. I was involved in research. To set the record straight, my position that I've actually published was to remove the Confederate flag, because it's not perfect.
Yeah.
But to turn it into a joint memorial for, with the USCT and the Union. And that was the middle ground, and there wasn't a middle ground.
Yeah.
But I did a lot of research.
Yeah.
And like one of the things I found about the committee, you mentioned Oswald Tillman. Baltimore Sun in 1911, July 2nd, both Oswald Tillman and James Mulligan, who was the committee chairman for the Union Monument, we didn't mention that, were at the Gettysburg Reunion. And they were in a Maryland group to create monuments to memorialize the war
Yeah.
and the veterans.
Yeah.
And in less than 7 days of returning, they started the committees. So they're at the Gettysburg Reunion and a committee to create monuments to memorialize the war and the veterans.
Yeah.
And within 7 days, they started. Now, let me reiterate, they weren't in a committee on how to oppress and intimidate the local black folks. And I say that in jest, but it seems like we assume it was meant to intimidate versus a war memorial. Now, as a Marine officer, as a veteran, naval aviator, I'm a stickler for details. In my book, 870 endnotes, 1,100 sources. And I've done a lot of research to even know exactly how many were slaveholders, which was statistically insignificant to the Union Acts. So what are your sources? Are you saying that my ancestors purposely put that there to intimidate Talbot County black folks? And
Yeah.
my ancestors had evil?
Yeah. And
Or
I
was that
did,
before we-
yeah. Let me interject there because I didn't say that.
Okay, no, you-
I said that in some areas of the South, there was a very clear effort to use this kind of statuary to intimidate. I have not found evidence that here in Talbot County, that was part of the effort. What I skipped over, and I shouldn't have, the evidence that I have found behind why the statue was put up, it was a political act on the part of the Democratic Party to put in place a rallying cry for the party against the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, in kind, tried to do similarly, which is to say, they tried to raise money for their own statue. They weren't successful. I think they raised a total of $600, and that wasn't going to do it. for a statue. The evidence I find says, sure, this was an effort at let's remember our ancestors, let's remember these brave men. I'm not downplaying that. But side by side, there was a real political impulse. And I've got the documentation if you want to look at it.
What is that?
What is it?
What is it?
Excuse me?
That's what we're asking. What is the sources?
What's your source for that?
What's
The letters from these Democratic politicians. That's what the sources are. Yes, sir.
You know me, don't spoil. I was his teacher. I was fortunate to take a military history course taught by C. Joseph Bernardo, Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Army. Dr. Bernardo was the person that was in charge of all the top secret documents that were in the United States military. He was like a librarian. And Dr. Bernardo was telling us about post-Civil War period. And one of the things that Dr. Bernardo found was that the policy of the United States military after 1900, they were having a problem with recruiting and getting people from the South, soldiers from the South. So the United States military started on a mission. And their mission was to try to get more people to join the United States Army, Navy, Marine Corps. So, the United States military, and all the documentation is right there in the military archives. They set on a campaign. What did they do? Camp A.P. Hill. Name some other ones, named after famous Confederate generals. They did that around 1912, 13, and 14. The policy was to try to bring people together, to try to get the South to get involved in the Union again. Because the people in the South were still hung up on this one line from the Declaration of Independence. Past usurpations from the South, we can throw off and get new cards for our posterity and our future. But they used it for the wrong reason. They'd forgotten that the Constitutional Convention, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, all voted to do away with slavery. Georgia, South Carolina, blocked it. That's right there in the papers for the Continental Congress. So that's why we had this thing that happened afterwards for the amendments to the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and so on and so forth. So they set about doing a campaign to try to get Southerners to join the military. And they did two things. Started naming forts after Confederate generals. The second thing they did was starting to put up monuments all over the South in an effort to try to let the people in the South know, hey, come join the United States Army. We're with you. You're Americans. Come back into the fold. And this is what they did. And all the documentation is right there in the United States military archives. And anybody can find it. But it's documented very well in Bernardo's book on American military policy.
But our question is this month.
It was they were mass produced, like Paul said, Bill said.
But it was done with private money. They're not doing government money.
Let me suggest if you're looking for documentation,
Or we had evidence.
Yeah. Let me suggest-
We know from the
Yeah.
side.
let me suggest you go over to the Talbot County Historical Society, ask for the file on the Talbot Boys statue, and go through it.
And I have, I'm on the board of directors of the society, sir.
Well,
The question I'm asking.
if you haven't seen indication that there was a political dimension to this, you're not doing a very good job of reading.
I would
Okay,
just,
okay, let's,
I
let's
just wanted to
stop
ask a
that
question.
right.
Is it a war memorial or was it meant to impress our Americans of African descent?
Yeah.
And we haven't answered, it's all politics, but that's what I came here to know. And do we have evidence?
No one's gonna know,
Yes, sir.
because it was done so long. So you talked about there was 300 statues built during this time.
Yeah.
How many of the statues have now been removed?
Have what?
How many of those 300 statues have now been removed?
40 to 50.
40 to 50?
Yeah. Now that's throughout the whole South.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many, because I haven't seen a figure, in Maryland were on public ground. But however many there were, every one of them has been removed, and this was the last one.
So if that statue would have had the gentleman that was from Talbot County on it, the admiral.
We don't see it.
Is that his name?
You can, we don't
So do you think it would have been done sooner?
would have gone 5 or 6 years sooner. But there was another statue, very similar, in Leesburg, Virginia, in front of the courthouse. Had a common soldier. And when they were removing the others, statues to individuals, this individual, as a senior military officer, made a decision to support the South. That's a traitor. When you talk to the common soldier, now it's a war memorial. Leesburg was one of the last ones removed. It was a very similar statue. That one was fascinating because the statue was owned by Daughters of the Confederacy. They never gave it to the state. They retained ownership, so they took it away.
Other questions?
Read the one in Richmond?
Just a couple.
No,
Okay.
Leesburg.
First, just about General Buchanan. He had resigned from the U.S. Navy, thinking that Maryland was going to enter the Confederacy. When it didn't, he was stuck and couldn't come back. So that's why he fought. At any rate, I digress. The first thing I wanted to say is the key history about the Talbot Boys is from T934, Eastern Confederate Monument by the Maryland Historic Trust. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union's 1st Eastern Shore Regiment included men of Trapp's Company H, who were sent to Culp's Hill on July 3rd, 1863. There they fought troops of the 1st Maryland Regiment, Confederate Regiment, which also included men from the Trapp area. The color sergeants of each side were cousins, both from Trapp. Robert W. Ross of the Union and P.M. Moore fatally wounded for the Confederates. The monument was sponsored by a committee formed in 1913, the 50th anniversary of the battle, and chaired by Seth, as you mentioned. After consideration of the statue for Buchanan, it was agreed to honor all the boys in gray. The base was erected in 1914, as you said. The statue was dedicated in 1916, as you said. Efforts in 1914 to raise funds for a Union monument were unsuccessful. Oswald Tillman's wife served on that committee to raise the funds. Second, it was also at that time that Easton lost its hospital to a fire, so that all the funds that needed to be raised were focused on safety for the county and raising the funds for that. That's why it didn't get done. Now, also, with regard to the origin of this at Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill has one of the first monuments at Gettysburg dedicated to the 2nd Maryland Regiment, which is the one trapped.
Yeah.
And when they visited that, they were impressed by the monuments that were there and wanted to replicate it here. That's what it was all about. It was all about male pride.
Yeah.
Okay? And just to address your point about the origin of taking down the Talbot Boys. First, I have it, good authority from a former council member.
Yeah.
At the time that the Douglas Memorial went up, which I was totally in support of, it was promised by the advocates for that they would never campaign to take down the Talbot Boys. But I digress. The campaign that you talked about that was started to take down the Talbot Boys was actually launched by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they launched a Racing Hate campaign in August of 2015. And it was triggered by the Dillon roof thing. But it was also because the Southern Poverty Law Center was on the rise.
All right, thank you. Did somebody here have a? Yes.
Well, please speak out. At the Naval Academy, the superintendent's house was known as Buchanan House. Well, they changed the name of Buchanan House now
Yeah.
because of.
Fraser House?
And they've changed the name of all the Fort Hood and all those have all been renamed now. And the thing is what I say it's history, I know so. You cannot change history. History is history. All you can do is affect how we move forward. We can only live and learn from history. And you cannot change it and you cannot erase it.
Yeah.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
I was gonna make a final comment. I'm not from the area, I'm from Annapolis. And
I'm getting a kick out of that.
We were never brought
To me, that's here, but
But we were
Well,
never brought up in Maryland.
to people who live on
Yeah.
the shore their whole life,
I
that
get
bridge
you.
is really long,
Yeah.
about 300 miles long.
Yeah.
But when I first came here, I'm a tour guide for bicycle tours in the area. And we came up and all the lawn signs are out in the midst of this campaign. And the comment I was gonna make is,
yeah,
you had a hard time finding a preserved Talbot history sign in the Easton city limits.
yeah,
And a hard time finding a remove the statue sign outside the city.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I would ride my bike out there and you could see as soon as you get outside of the city limits, the signs change.
So I have a
Except
question.
Unionville, by the way, which was all
Yeah.
moved the statue.
So I have a question for Lynn as a county council member. Is there some reason why they didn't make this a public vote?
I think y'all should be clear.
Well, I wasn't on the council.
I know you weren't, but
There was, well.
but that makes it an even
The
better.
council person who really led the fight, as I recall watching, was DeVillio.
Yeah,
And he introduced an administrative resolution that prohibited any public debate about removing the statue. That's why there wasn't any public debate.
Oh, I think there was a motion to put it on the ballot, and that went down to defeat.
But they wouldn't have a discussion.
But I think that was talked about, having it be a decision by the voters of Talbot County.
They wouldn't sponsor the resolution.
yeah, you have,
Oh, did they? Okay.
No,
yeah. In order for a vote to be taken by the council, it has
Oh,
to
that
make
they
it
just, okay.
into their agenda. That's interesting.
So, one thing. So there's a lot.
So.
Let's see if somebody else has something to contribute.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna make the
Any
joke
others?
that I'm from Texas, I'm further than Annapolis. I didn't grow up anywhere around here.
Well,
Yes,
I think all of these conversations need to be tempered with the distinctions between places of honor and remembering history. And you can remember history and you can remember the individuals involved in that history. But there's also an appropriate place to honor that history. And a public site, a public courthouse, where perhaps potentially, I don't know the history of Easton, if that was a site where slaves were sold. Yes, then that is not a place where you honor that.
yeah,
You have to put it in the appropriate form. It's all about perspective.
Yeah.
And where is the right place to honor things and where is the right place to remember things.
I think that is a great way to end this discussion. So.
well, I want to thank you all for A, coming out, for B, participating, a lot of good discussion. We're not going to change anybody's minds, I'm sure, but that's okay. We're not about changing people's minds.
And
It's
the,
just healthy to get the discussion.
and the room will stay open if you want. I bet no one can get in any fisticuffs around here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.